Wait for the other people to show up. It's coming. All right. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Welcome to session 16 of our slow reading of the Fusus al-Hikam. I hope you didn't struggle with this chapter too much. I went through Izutsu's Sufism and Taoism, the first section of it, which is about 200 odd pages or so, over the week. I hadn't read this book in over probably 20 years. And I reviewed it, or 2 days, and I have to say I am very impressed with, even more impressed than I was when I first read it all those many years ago, because effectively this book is a very concise modern commentary on the Fusus al-Hikam and all the main themes. And his 13th chapter, especially entitled Creation, the first half of it anyway, specifically covers this chapter that we're going to cover. Be that as it may, there's a few things that appear to me that between these three translators that we're reading is quite opaque in their translations. This doesn't show up obviously in the original commentary tradition because a lot of this terminology, some of it doesn't require translation, but others of it does require translation, or gloss at least, in the original Arabic. But in the English translation, there seems to be a real confusion between these three translators, and also I have noticed among some of the commentators, modern commentators, on the difference between the concept of will and the concept of volition. Now, in English, both of these words derive from the Latin valere, which means will, but it's just the sense of will and volition change between whatever way the Latin root is conjugated. But in English, if we want to have a very precise understanding between what will is and what volition is, we need to define this. So will is the mashia in the Arabic, and the volition is the irada, right? So this is how I kind of define it. A volition is the act of willing to do something, right? That means that the will comes first. Your will is what enables you to form volitions, right? Your ability or your capacity to will to do something. So the will comes first and the volition is second. And this is in keeping with also the metaphysics that is behind the will and volition with Ibn Arabi himself, where the will represents a universal unfolding of the Godhead, and the volition represents its particularized instantiations. So when we're confronted by the two Quranic verses, the first one in the Surah Al-Nahl in the 40th verse, إِنَّمَا قَوْلِنَا لِشَيْءٍ إِذَا أَرَدْنَهُ أَن نَقُولَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُن. Our word to a thing whensoever we desire it is to say to it, be and it is. And also then in the 82nd verse of the Surah Yasin, إِنَّمَا أَمْرُهُ إِذَا أَرَدَ شَيْئًا أَن يَقُولَ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُن. Its command whensoever it desires anything is to say to it, be and it is, right? Now, if we were to unpack these two verses on a metaphysical trajectory and a metaphysical schema, right? Although with Ibn Arabi, he makes this distinction, but at least in the pristine Shia metaphysics of the Imams, where a lot of this terminology actually emerges, although generally acknowledged by the Sunni commentators, but the Shia commentators of Ibn Arabi do underscore this. The concept of command as synonymous with the will, the divine will, is one that the Shia tradition, whether in its Ismaili form or in its 12-ver Imami form, have glossed a long time ago. It occurs in Khulani's Usul min al-Kafi, you will find this glossed this way. So, innama qawluna li-shay'in, our word to a thing, right, would represent the concept of the universal will. إذا أردناه أن نقول له. So when we say to a thing, once we desire it, we desire that it become, inna naqul lahu kun fayakun. We say to it, be and it is, right? So let's break this down into this tripartite schemata that Ibn Arabi is laying out in this particular chapter, that it is really confusing a lot of people also in the translation. We have a tripartite structure in this verse. First, the universal will, then the universal volition, and then the determination, or the qadar. Now, in the commentary of Abdul Razzaq Kashani, who, by the way, was a Shiite, he really, I think more than any of the commentators, both before him and after him, really glosses this point. And this is a point that Izutsu then underscores in the translation of that particular chapter 13. In that, when we're talking about this particular verse, one is the universal will. So when God is saying or commanding to something for it to be, right, its desire represents the volition. So the first part of the verse is the universal will. The second part of the verse is the universal volition. And nagulahu kun fe, and then the kun feyakun represents the process of the qadar, the process of the universal determination. What Kashani particularly puts his finger on, which I think is extremely helpful, is that he makes the qadar, the determination, the divine determination, synonymous with the ayan al-thabita. So the ayn al-thabita, the immutable archetypal essence, is the level of the qadar. It's the level of the divine determination, right? So right there, in this particular verse, and in the very clear way that Kashani has glossed this particular verse, and in the way that it's functioning with Ibn Arabi, so the will, Mashia, is the phase al-aqdas, the volition, the irada, is the phase al-muqaddas, the holy effusion, and then the third term is the determination, qadar, which is the immutable archetypal essence that is now coming into, into existentiation. Now, another point, someone just couldn't get their head around this and found this particular part of this chapter that we're about to read just completely inscrutable as to what Ibn Arabi is talking about when he says that an entity is responsible for its own self-generation. And then what we have with this particular verse, when it says kun fayakun, why does that denote that the thing itself is bringing itself into existence? And although the way that Ibn Arabi is articulating it is very unclear, it is actually very apparent what he means by this, in that at the level of the universal will, right? So at the level where innama qawluna li-shay'in, right? When our word to a thing, right? That represents the process at the level of the universal will, where these ayana thabita, are existentiated as these universal intelligibles in the mind of God, right? So it is at the level of the volition, which then is the next part of the verse, right? Aratnahu an nahu lahu. When we desire to a thing, we say to it, right? That is then the volition, and then the next part of the process, kun fayakun, be and it is. So the be as the command to become is merely bringing potentiality into actuality. This is what Ibn Arabi is trying to tell us in this particular verse. The way he phrases it, I know it is very, it's very unclear, it doesn't understand, but this is an extremely important and subtle point of Akbarian metaphysics that just stumps a lot of people, whether they read it here in the Fusus al-Hikam or whether they read it within the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, as to what the Sheikh is talking about. Riaz, if you can keep your questions until after the reading, then you can be the first to ask your question. I'll come to you first, as a matter of fact. So anyway, let's just read this first, and I will tell you that wherever the word will occurs now in this particular chapter, from the Austin translation, I'm going to call it volition rather than will, because he's not talking about Mashiach. He's not talking about the hidden treasure desiring to be known. We're talking about the point where he is bringing things. Godhead is bringing things into being at the level of the volition, at the level of the phase al-Muqaddas. So the wisdom of opening in the word of Salih. Among his signs are the riding beasts, because of the variety of the paths. Some follow the true course, while others traverse trackless wastes. The former are possessed of true vision, the latter have missed the way. To both there come from God revelations of inner realities from every side. And he goes on. No, may God prosper you, that the creative command, the Amr, is essentially based on unevenness in which triplicity is implicit, since 3 is the first of the uneven or odd numbers. It is from this divine plane that the cosmos is created. He says, whensoever we wish a thing, we only say, or whensoever we desire a thing, we only say to it, be, and it is. There being the essence, the volition, and the word. Were it not for the essence, the will, which denotes the particular tendency to bring something into being, and the word be, kun, accompanying that tendency, that thing would not be. Furthermore, the triple unevenness is manifest in that thing by which it's being brought into being and it's being said to exist may be said to be true. This principle of oddness or unevenness constitutes its thingness, its hearing, and its obeying of its creator's command to come into being. These 3 aspects of the creature corresponds to 3 in the creator. Its latent essence in its state of non-existence corresponds to the essence of its creator. Its hearing or receptivity to the volition of its creator, and its compliance with the creative command to his saying word be, kun. It is he, and as obeying the command, the becoming is attributed to it. Indeed, were it not able to come into being of itself on receiving the command, the word, it would not come to be. In truth, it was none other than the thing itself that brought itself into being from non-existence when the command was given. And this is what I'm talking about. So the non-existence you have to bear in mind here with Ibn Arabi is not Adam al-Mutlaq. It's not the absolute non-existence. It's the relative non-existence, the Adam al-Idafiyah, the relative non-existence that puts the immutable archetypal essences, the ayana, Thabita, in a sort of a no man's land in between non-existence and actual essential existence. Thus, the reality establishes that the coming into being stems from the thing itself and not from the reality, who is the origin of the command. Thus, he says of himself, when we will a thing to be, our command to it is only that we say, be, and it is. Here, he attributes the becoming of the thing itself at the command of God, and God speaks true. This being understood in the command, just as when one is feared and obeyed, commands the servant to stand. The servant stands obediently. With respect to the standing of the servant, only the command to do so belongs to the master. The standing being the servant's action and not that of the master. This is a beautiful metaphor, because as we read previously, the ayana thabita, the immutable archetypal essences, once they are existentiated as these universals, then then demand their further existentiation, right? So just by the command of saying kun, be, to these immutable archetypal essences at the level of the presence of the volition, of the irada, then these things come into existentiation, ainiyah, as an essential reality, rather than as an immutable idea in the mind of God, as a platonic form, for lack of a better word. Thus, bringing or coming into being is based on triplicity, or rather a bipolar triplicity, one being of the reality, the other of the creature. This principle of triplicity pervades to the existence of ideas arrived at by logical proofs. And now Ibn Arabi is just giving us a basic definition of a syllogism. Thus, a proof arrived at by a syllogism is made up of three parts in a particular way that inevitably yields a result. First of all, the person establishes two premises, both of which include two terms, so there are four terms. However, just a second. Okay. First of all, the person establishes two premises, both of which include two terms, so that there are four terms. However, one of the terms is present in both premises to link the other two, so that there are really three parts because of the repetition of one term in both premises. The proof comes into being when this particular arrangement occurs, which is the binding of the two premises together by the repetition of one term producing a triplicity. If you read the notes that Canner Dagley puts in this particular part of the passage, his explanation is extremely good. The special condition attendant on this is that the major should be more general than the middle term, or at least similar, if the result is to be true. Otherwise, it will be untrue. This kind of thing occurs in creation, as when acts are attributed solely to the servant without reference to God, or when coming into being, which is what we are concerned, is ascribed solely to God, while the reality ascribes it to that to which be is addressed. So God only utters the existential command of existentiation, and then this thing comes into being by its own desire to be, right? And in many ways, this is, if you think about it, this is one of the commentators, this is Hossein Kharazmi, very briefly alludes to this, that what we're seeing with the existentiation of these immutable archetypal forms is the very same process that we are witnessing with the hidden treasure desiring to be known, right? So this is mirroring that exact process of I was a hidden treasure and I desired to be known, therefore I created creation to be known. The existentiation of the immutable archetypal essences is also following a very similar trajectory of existentiation, except whereas the hidden treasure, nothing knows it before it knows itself. With the immutable archetypal essences, they are known in the mind of God itself. But what becomes especially an important point to remember here in this particular schema is that the qabil, or the receptive, or the receptacle here, is also God. So this is where the whole wahdat al-wujud element of this is quite pronounced. So both the fa'il, the actor, and the recipient, the actor and this patient, on one level of the trajectory are both God at the same time, right? And this is why he says that this process itself is following almost the same kind of process as we're witnessing in the hidden treasure desiring to be known. And the reason for this is simple, is because all manifestation throughout all of existence is merely the hidden treasure desiring to know itself through that particular locus of manifestation. Then he goes on. For example, if we wish to prove that the cosmos is caused, we would say every originated thing has a cause, in which we have the two terms, originated and cause. In the second premise, we would say the cosmos is originated, the term originated being repeated in both premises. The third term is therefore cosmos, the conclusion being that the cosmos has a cause. The same term, namely cause, appears both in the first premise and in the conclusion. The special point is the repetition of the word originated. The special condition is the generality of the occasioning principle, which is, in the case of the existence of the originated being, the cause that, as the major term, is general with respect to the originating of the cosmos from God, which is basically, in a very elusive way, saying kind of what I just said before. We have decided that every originated being has a cause, whether the middle term is similar to the major term or whether the latter is more general than it and coming within its provenance, and the conclusion is true. The principle of triplicity is thus apparent also in the creation of concepts arrived at by syllogistic proofs. The origin of all becoming is thus triplicity. For this reason, the wisdom of Salih, which God manifested in delaying the destruction of his people for 3 days, was no vain promise, since it came true in the cry by which God destroyed them, so that they became stricken down in their tents. On the first of the 3 days, the faces of the people changed color to yellow, on the second to red, and on the third to black. On the completion of the 3rd day, their essential natures were ready to receive the manifestation of wickedness within them, which manifestation is called destruction. So on the 1st day represents the will of God, the 2nd day, the volition of God, and the 3rd day, the determination of God. Mashiach, Irada, Qadar. The yellowing of the faces of the damned corresponds to the shining of the faces of the blessed, as in his saying, faces on that day will be shining, stemming from the word unveiled, which means manifested. In this way, the yellowness of their faces on the 1st day signals the manifestation of damnation in the people of Salih on the final day, corresponding to the redness in what he says concerning the blessed, laughing. Since laughter is a cause of redness in the face, being in the case of the blessed, a rosiness of the cheeks. Corresponding to the blackness of the skins of the damned is what he says of the blessed, that they are joyful, being the effect of joy on their complexions as the blackness in the case of the damned. I don't know why Ibn Arabi is putting this example, because the same thing can be explained in a much clearer way than he is here. Thus, he uses the term tidings, bushra, for both parties, the blessed and the damned. That is, he tells them things that affect their complexions, causing them to change to a color other than the one they had before. In the case of the blessed, he says, their Lord brings them glad tidings of mercy from him and his good pleasure. While in the case of the damned, bring them tidings of a painful punishment. Each party showing outwardly the effects of this address on their souls. This is because what is outwardly manifest only occurs with the inner effect of the sense of these words. In truth, they themselves affect themselves, even as they themselves come into being of themselves, in obedience to the divine command. God's is the final argument. Lillahi hujjatul baligh. Whoever truly understands this wisdom and establishes it in himself and realizes it, releases himself from dependence on others, and knows that good and evil come to him only from himself. If you notice, Mr. Abrahamov seems to have a problem with this statement and claims that Ibn Arabi is contradicting himself. Not quite. I think he didn't really quite understand that we're talking about levels here, because what this particular statement from Ibn Arabi means is at the level of the qadar. It's at the level of the determination, the 3rd of the terms, not the 1st or the 2nd of the terms. By good, I mean what is in consonance with his aim, in harmony with his nature and disposition, and by evil on what is contrary to his aim and in conflict with his nature and disposition. He who has such knowledge or vision excuses all creatures regarding what they manifest, even though they themselves make no excuse, knowing as he does that all he undergoes is from himself, as we have mentioned previously, to the effect that knowledge depends on what is known. And on this particular point, Kashani, which Izutsu also translates that particular passage from his commentary, basically gives us some good and bad news from this particular metaphysical system as regards to the efficacy of prayer. I don't necessarily agree with this perspective, because I find it a little bit mechanical. And the Shiite in me has this notion of al-bada'a, the alteration of the divine will, which cannot agree with this particular point of view. I think it's a little bit too mechanical in the way that it's attributing to how these things work in the greater scheme of things. But anyway, Kashani says that you can't change God's will, so therefore, prayer is basically what Ibn Arabi says in what was it, the second or third chapter of the Fusus, that is just basically when we pray, we can't really change the divine will, so we're just basically praising God. And the Gnostics actually know this, and the non-Gnostics, well, they continue to plead with God to change their condition. I'm not so certain that that is the case, but that's a different discussion. Just to finish this chapter, thus he says to himself, when something contrary to his aim befalls him, your two hands cast the die, and your own mouth breathe the breath of your life. God speaks true and guides aright. And that was the chapter of Saleh. And who was it who had their hand up right at the beginning and wanted to speak? Now's your chance to.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, go for it.
Hopefully this is still fresh in my mind. Regarding this division between potentiality and actuality, do we have to be careful in assigning temporality to not restrict the powers of God?
Sure, yeah. I mean, but yes and no. I mean, we should be careful in attributing temporality, because where any action of God is concerned, it transcends time. But in order to understand, at least as a kind of a placeholder, I think we cannot help but posit temporality to a cause, or to a chain of causality.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? I did translate this particular part from Khawarazmi, because I thought his explanation of this triplicity was very clear. I mean, he gets this from Qaisari's commentary, but the way that he breaks it down in the Persian is much clearer than Qaisari himself, where he's quoting the particular passage in this chapter that we just read, where Ibn Arabi says the matter is inherently based on singularity and has a triadic nature. Khawarazmi breaks it down. He says this means that from the state of singularity, the world has been brought into existence as the basis of creation is knowledge, and knowledge necessarily requires the knower and the known. Thus, a triadic nature is necessary, and 3 is the first individual number. From the state of singularity, which is the divine state, the world has come into existence because creation demands 3 things. First, the knower, which is the active essence and the agent, its shadow. Second, the known, which are the fixed entities, or the ayan thabita, the immutable archetypal essences, and the receptive, the qabid, which is the shadow. Third, knowledge, which is the relation between the knower and the known, and the effect, which is its shadow. So in all of these stages of the unfoldment, we have the actor and its recipient, where you can also then posit the light shadow dichotomy in that respect. And from stage to stage, this happens in all of these stages of creation, which I find an extremely illuminationist or ishraqi way of explaining this particular issue. But this is the way that Khawarazmi basically breaks it down, I found. And he gets this from Qaisari's commentary, but I found his explanation extremely clear in the way that he put it, more than any of the others.
Can I check my understanding with you, please?
Sure.
So there's like a level at which everything is sort of possible, perhaps, where all these sorts of maybe possibilities and timelines kind of live in a kind of quantum state of possibility, right?
Yeah.
And then if you apply it to, say, plants or animals, it's something that's like the fact that they can exist is because of God's will. But then their volition is sort of like the spirit of that thing that tries to sort of
Yes,
keep
yes.
it, preserve
Good,
itself, like of a
good,
species or
good,
something.
good point. Good point. You brought this up. Exactly. The volition is at the level of the spirit of the matter. And just remember what Ibn Arabi said in the previous couple of chapters, the spirit of all things is God within them. So when we're talking about the ruh of a particular manifest form, the spirit of a manifest form, that is the name al-batin, the interior or the hidden. And that is always the placeholder in this metaphysics for the divine itself. So that spirit of whatever it is, whether it be human, animal, or plant, that is the divine imprint. And so its externalization then it is itself.
Yeah, it's like everything. That's one of the arguments I use with atheists, that everything appears to instinctively be trying really hard to be
Yes.
and perpetuate itself instinctively. And that there is no, I mean, all scientists work on faith, essentially, because no one knows how to explain the desire for everything to be and self-perpetuate. Other than God's will, there is no other explanation.
Yep. Well, God's will here being the universal existentiation of everything in potentiality. That's the level of the universal will. So on that level of the Mashiach, everything that is, has been, and will be exists in its potentiality in that multiplicity within the singular mind of God. And then the next stage is the process of their actual existentiation, which is the volition. And then finally, per what we just read in this chapter, when metaphorically speaking, God says be to them, then they bring themselves into existence by virtue of their potentiality that has already been existentiated in God's mind as a potential.
Because if you think about it, all these mutations that happen that allow species to keep going, there's so many variations that exist, and one of them just has to go well with the environment. But I always feel like what that theory of evolution was missing was the will of the thing to be and to persist.
Yeah.
Which is, it's at the mechanistic level, that theory wasn't able to offer that, and was maybe part of how, everything got stuck in the how and never the why. The why is never discussed in science.
This is a great point you raise, because basically what it means that from the point of view of the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, the survival instinct is actually the divine instinct itself. So you can connect the survival instinct of any given species to that desire of that is divine to be.
Yeah. And we do recognize that, because unless people are strictly utilitarian in the way they deal with other species, we recognize them to be part of God's portfolio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But even, I mean, the utilitarian perspective on this is extremely illogical, in my opinion. And it is based on such narrow premises of proof that it seems, in my opinion, to miss many forests for trees. So, but yeah, I mean, this is what Ibn Arabi is saying. He's saying that, that preservation and survival instinct that every species, whatever they are, whether they be human, animal, plant, that is the divine imprint. That is the hidden treasure, who has desired to be known and is maintaining that knownness of itself by preserving itself and surviving 100%.
It's kind of satanic if you don't see it that way. Really.
Well, it is, and this is why these sorts of utilitarian perspectives of modern philosophy, modern Western philosophy, in my opinion, if we use the Satan metaphor as a metaphor only, are satanic for precisely that reason, because they only imbue value of life to only one particular species, and even within that particular species, they're, you know, in their minds, there's subspecies of that, and some are, you know, worthy more than others, even amongst the human species itself. And this is where, you know, the Satanism of this particular perspective, to use that metaphor, really shows itself by denuding value, you know, of things throughout creation. Whereas from this perspective, everything, yes, there are hierarchies of value, you know, there are hierarchies, you know, of worthiness from sort of an ontological perspective, where the human is at the very top of the ladder. But nevertheless, by the same token, as he says elsewhere, all of these are divine imprints. The entirety of creation is a particular imprint of, each individual element of it is a particular divine imprint of the hidden treasure desiring to know itself. Everything. Nothing escapes this. And so with the metaphysics that he then presents here, where both the actor is divine and also the recipient is simultaneously a shadow of the divine, or the mirror, as he used in the very first chapter, then this begins to kind of tweak our perspective on the God-human relationship about things.
Could you talk a little bit more about the concept of the recipient, please?
Sure. Here with Ibn Arabi, every action produces its effect. So this is one of the very controversial elements of Ibn Arabi's logic and ontology that to this day is being debated hotly. But contrary to the standard logical systems of philosophy up to that point, which is basically the system of Aristotle, a cause is one element and an effect is another element. Ibn Arabi disagrees, right? He is saying that the cause abides in the effect. And in essence, the effect of the cause is basically an element of the cause itself. So the effect is in essence, not even, we can't even use the word effect in this context. We have to call it the caused of the cause. Right? So then the qabel, the recipient, as Ibn Arabi uses, is a shadow or an instantiation or the mirror of the cause.
It's the recipient. Are we talking about
whatever it is,
the events, like it's like memory, event, like what happens and what is witnessed and recorded?
Everything that you witness in creation, everything, absolutely everything. Everything that you are looking at now, everything that you are perceiving now, whether it's yourself or outside of yourself, these are all recipients. These are all qawabil, the patience of a cause, which has caused them, right? And so everything that you perceive is a shadow of that first cause. And it is the first cause from another perspective, because the light is casting its own shadow. And the shadow has no reality beyond the light. So this is what Ibn Arabi is saying. And one way that I have phrased it in some of my own writings is that the alpha exists for the omega. So without an omega, there is no alpha. Alpha cannot even claim any form of alphahood without the omega making it so. Such that the cause abides in the effect. Or another way, one way that the Bab puts it in one of his pieces of writing, which I found very profound, is that we cannot speak of azaliya, pre-eternity, without speaking of abadiya, post-eternity. One is the reflection of it. So if we're thinking about concepts of eternity, pre and post-eternity, eternity a parte ante, an eternity of the past, and then eternity in the future, both are defining terms of each other. And ultimately, they're the same thing.
It's like it's an infinity loop, basically.
Yes, precisely. This is an infinity loop. It's exactly what Ibn Arabi is saying. Precisely what he's saying. Yeah.
Quite mind-bending.
It's absolutely. But you know, this great sheikh, this great Andalusian has been bending minds for 800 years now.
Mm,
This is why I say that this man has a stature, in my view anyway, that he's like a second Muhammad, you know, practically.
mm, mm. Yeah, thank you.
Mm. I mean, can you folks imagine if we had some of these extremely lockjawed atheists, you know, to sit them, you know, hunker them down, you know, even, you know, take them hostage for 27 days and make them study intently with commentary on each of these chapters of the Fusus al-Hikam over a 27-day period, and then throw them out into the world and say, okay, now explain your worldview. You know, they would have nervous breakdowns at the end of this process, because the kind of perspective that Ibn Arabi is offering is so different than the common canon of you know, standard exoteric religious narratives about the God world and humans and what religion even is, that it defies pigeonholing. You know, this is why both fundamentalists hate Ibn Arabi as well as hardcore, you know, secularists, atheist, secular modernists hate his guts. Both of these, they don't like him because he's challenging them both simultaneously.
Sidi, I have several questions here.
Sure.
So the first one, uh, what exactly is the difference here between Kawn and Takwin, which is the topic of this chapter, and
Yes.
Wujud on the other side?
Okay. Although William Chittick kind of reverses these terms in his book, The Sufi Path of Knowledge, the difference between wujud and takween is that wujud is the condition, takween is the state. So let's put it from what we read about makan and makana. So wujud is the makana, and the takween or the takawwun is the makan. Does that make sense?
Yes, in some sense, makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, then the next one is the pairing between the triplicity in creator and triplicity in created things.
Okay.
When that ilahi, the essence of God, is opposed to aran thabite, the essence of the immutable things.
Yeah.
But then the next two, to me, the pairing seems little bit illogical, because he is pairing the divine irade of Allah with sama of the created thing.
Yeah.
And the command kun of Allah Ta'ala with imtithal, obeying the command of the
Yes.
creating thing.
Yeah.
Would it be not more harmonic if we pair the irade of Allah Ta'ala with obeying the command from the created thing, and the word kun, the saying of the command, with sama, with hearing of the...
Yes and no, we can look at it that way. I've actually thought about this several times in the past. Yes and no. I mean, the correspondences are neither here nor there. If you ask me personally, I think that the schema that we have in the Imami Hadith is far more logical than the triplicity that Ibn Arabi is positing. Because the way that they explain it, they explain it in the form of the heptad, of the will, the volition, the determination, the authorization, realization, the appointed time, and then the decree of being. And that, or the kitab, that to me is a far more logical schema, because first of all, it exists outside of the essence. The essence only inhabits the dualitude of knowledge and power, right? But the action of God from that point of view, the emanations of God are following this sevenfold trajectory. That to me makes a lot more sense. I find Ibn Arabi on these particular things a little bit inconsistent. And not just in the Fusus al-Hikam, but also in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. When I read it, and I read them as a Shiite, it continually reminds me that the Imams have explained these processes a lot more clearer than Ibn Arabi has. Even though occasionally you will come across a lot of different things that Ibn Arabi says that resonate very deeply with the kind of reasoning that we have in the Imami literature, but yet the Imams explain these things a lot clearer about how this process actually works. So yes, you're right. In a sense, it is a sort of a self-contradiction, but it's not a deliberate one. It's due to the imprecision in which some of these terms are being used, in my opinion. And it is only Kashani and then his later Shiite commentators like Sayyid Haydar al-Muli, and then much later than that, figures like Ibn Abi Jamhur al-Ahsai, who really, honed all of these terminologies and these logical categories down and fit them neatly with the Imami. The best of them, I would say, would be Qadi Said Qummi, who was a contemporary Mullah Sadra, and in his own Sharh Tawhid al-Saduq, his commentary on the Kitab al-Tawhid of Sheikh al-Saduq, he really brings this stuff out. And he cites Ibn Arabi, he cites various passages out of the Futuhat and also the Fusus al-Hikam, but then he, arranges it and really, fine hones this. So I agree with you. Yeah, there's an imprecision in the way that Ibn Arabi is using these terminology that I don't like. I think that it can be expressed a lot more precisely than he has. Yeah.
Okay, this is a little bit off topic, but do you think that this imprecision is some kind inherent because of he is commenting based on Sunni narrative?
Yes.
And if he was going to comment the same topic from the Shia perspective, it would be very
precise,
more precise and clear and
we can only speculate, but I think yes, I think that's maybe part of the problem. But on the other hand, Ibn Arabi was living in a melting pot culture of Andalusia, Spain, that had close proximate relationship with the Fatimids. And from what we understand, these North Africans were very, they knew the Ismaili theosophy like the back of their hand, because you see this for example, in some of Ibn Arabi's predecessors, like Ibn Masara. Even though they weren't Shiites, they were nevertheless very much engaged with, the several hundred years of philosophical speculation that was coming out of the Ismaili camp. So they knew this. But with Ibn Arabi, I don't know why these things get imprecise. And that's not the only one. I put a post up on the theurgy list this week, because I went through, over the last month, I went through the 198th chapter of the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, where he discusses the lunar mansions. This is also the chapter which Titus Burckhardt based his book, The Mystical Astrology of Ibn Arabi, upon. And I then compared it to the discussion of the lunar mansions in al-Buni's Shams al-Ma'arif, the first book. And Ibn Arabi is all over the place. The letters and the mansions do not align at all. And, whereas Buni doesn't really speak immediately in the first book of the Shams al-Ma'arif on which divine names align with which of the mansions, Ibn Arabi does, which is very helpful. And his discussion is very cosmological, but there's a misalignment. And Buni was a North African. And according to al-Buni, some of the teachers that he had were also some of the teachers that Ibn Arabi claims, like al-Uryabi and Abu Madian. These are part of the trajectory, the lineage, same lineage that Ibn Arabi belonged to. Yet Ibn Arabi is all over the place. None of these letters align. They don't even align based on the letter scheme of the Maghrebi system, let alone the Eastern one that al-Buni is primarily working with, even though he was himself also a Maghrebi. So yeah, these issues do exist in Ibn Arabi. This is why, as much as I love Ibn Arabi, I am always open, to point these kind of discrepancies out. And what you just pointed out in this particular chapter that we just read is very much an issue that has been on my mind for a long time. But to his credit, Kashani, and then later on, in the later tradition, during the Timurid period and afterwards with a lot of these Shiite thinkers, they fine-tune all of these issues perfectly.
The next one, can you say a little bit more about the importance here, the symbolic of the colors, the yellow, red, and black, which are mentioned here?
Yeah, this is a good point. This is a very good point because this color scheme has other applications later on. So let's see. Where does it begin? For this reason, blah, blah, blah. Let's go for the colors. So he says yellow, yellowness on their faces in the first day. The color yellow represents the ruh. So that would be the Jabaruti aspect, right? On the first day. Redness is depending on which day, because some systems, I myself do this, I apply the color red to the earth. But here, Ibn Arabi is applying it to the second day. And so this would obviously correspond to the level of the soul, right? The redness. And then the final day, the black is when it occurs to the earth. So with Ibn Arabi, the color black represents the earth itself. So yellow would be ruh, red would be soul, nafs, and then finally the black would be the earth, the turab.
Okay, and a final one, which you already mentioned in the beginning, that let's say, if we say that everything is by which happens, the fatalistic perspective that everything is decided by fate, it is problematic. But here in some place, I feel that Sheikh Muhyiddin goes to the other side, saying that everything which happens to us is exactly a result of our actions and states, which, let's say, to poor persons like me may say little bit disheartening, because there is no one, as we hope, that God who will come and save us. But you connect it with the Shia conception of Bada. If we put these things together.
This is what I'm saying, is that from my perspective, this scheme here, it's like, wanting to have one's cake and eat it too, and there's no logical consistency. So I think Abrahamov didn't really understand what Ibn Arabi is saying, but by the same token, even though he knows Shiism well, Abrahamov, he didn't kind of catch on to this. With the Shiite Akbarians from Haydar al-Muli onwards, this issue of Bada does get addressed. And they really bring in the Shiite hadith, especially the famous hadith about al-Amr bayn Amrayn. I think, if I remember correctly, I think it was either Haydar al-Muli in his Jami al-Asrar that very briefly says that the al-Bada, right, is always, in a process of actualizing with a given thing. So the divine fiat would exist at the level of the Ain Thabita, right? And the Bada, the alteration from one point to another, would occur in the instantiation, the actual material wujud ainiya of that thing. And he says it in these terms, that all possibility of whether something goes this way or that way already is inherent in the divine imprint of the Ayn Thabita, right? And it isn't the case, which is very interesting way of amending what Ibn Arabi is saying. It isn't the case that what occurs or what we perceive as having occurred is all that God wrote on the matter, and that's it, and we can't question it. No, he's saying that every possibility exists within that Ayn Thabita itself. But then the trajectory followed in its actualization actualize one particular horizon event for that thing versus another. Nevertheless, it is possible by virtue of these multiplicities of possibilities existing in a singular immutable archetypal essence to occur in any other way. And that is the bada. That is the al-bada within the immutable archetypal essence of that particular thing. And what is interesting is that is also then becomes the responsibility of the thing itself, but it is the divine imprint, it is that Hadrat al-Ilahiyya, that divine presence that is already inhabiting that immutable archetypal essence, and that then triggers the alternative path that is already inherent within that thing. So then that's the explanation for what al-Bada is, which I find it's a perfect explanation, but in the way that Ibn Arabi is putting it here, and then the way that Hashani is initially glossing on it, is very mechanical in the way that he's putting it. Yeah. Vanessa, did you want to say something?
Would I be getting carried away if I tried to relate what you just said to the Schrodinger's cat experiment?
The what?
The Schrodinger's cat experiment.
Brief us on what that is, please.
It's a very famous quantum physics experiment that basically before the researchers observed the effect of what they'd done, all the possibilities existed.
Yes.
That the cat was both like alive and dead, and yeah, so it's kind of the idea of the observer affecting what actually manifests, but before something has been observed, everything is sort of in a possible kind of state. I'm not doing it any justice, but I was hoping you'd know what it is. So
but this is interesting that such a experiment has actually been done, because this is exactly how the Shiite Akbarians will explain this sort of thing about the concept of the alteration of things that can occur at any time. In that, these immutable essences in the mind of God already contain within themselves every conceivable possibility of being.
Does that relate to the concept of the zero?
Sure.
Or the ace
Yeah.
in the cards?
It could, yeah.
But then there's that's where free will seems to be involved, is like this we were saying before, the spirit or something, like what is actioned. We seem to have some degree of, we have a choice or participation in what is actioned.
Well,
and in a way, is that sort of is
sure,
that what we live with, or
that's sort of a kind of a surface gloss on what that means. One way to put it is that on the issue of free will and predestination, is that all possibilities are already predetermined or predestined in a particular essence, but whatever choice that is made in the essential actualization of that thing follows a particular causality until at some point this, the train of this causality is changed in another direction. And that requires awareness. And this is why then the point is emphasized and re-emphasized and again throughout the tradition, is that, when you're walking a spiritual path, the more awareness that you gain from walking this path, the more you have that freedom of choice as to which direction to take. Whereas the more you are asleep, or the less aware you are, the more you actually have control over the choice of things. So then going to the final paragraph of this particular chapter that we just read, this is what Ibn Arabi is saying, because he's assuming that the person who is reading this is someone who's already aware on a high level, is following a spiritual path. And so, first he's telling them that whatever happens to you is your own fault, but by the same token, you can take another turn at any point. And then whatever chain of cause and effects that have been following you around up until that point that may have been negative, once you take the other turn, may possibly, take another turn entirely.
This is very much confirmed by something I observed when I used to do readings for people, that the people who were the most, I'll say, less aware or resigned and fatalistic, in that they came wanting to know what was going to happen, which I never think is a good attitude. They were the easiest to read for. So their timelines were their futures were very clear and easy to see. But the people who were the hardest to read for, and I maybe only met 2 or 3 of them in all my years, they were people who were very conscious themselves, like usually, quite very, what you describe as very awake people. And they didn't have trajectories that were concrete because they were in a state of awareness and choosing. So the more resigned people were, or not very awake, the more things were laid out in front of them for years ahead, often. Which, obviously ethically, I don't believe in simply telling people to just, I believe you have to empower people to choose and all of that, right? So I think the problem in the fortune telling thing is that people they take away their choice. They say this is what's going to be, and maybe that's comforting in that people can relinquish, having to try, they can relinquish effort or whatever. But I think that is why that sort of thing is prohibited, interfering with God's work, because of the removal of free will.
You can't really interfere with God's work, or maybe you can in this sense, is that when you are trying to reassure, or the opposite to certain people that you do divination for, perhaps what you're seeing in the particular trajectory is not what these people need to hear. They may need to hear something completely different, that they need to change that trajectory. But when you're reading it based on whatever trajectory that they're following, then they're not going to make that effort to make that change, to raise their awareness to make that necessary change. And God is not going to do it for them. There's a saying in Persian, as ma harikat as khuda barakat. From us is the movement, and from God comes the blessings, right? So if you put this to Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, right, on a given decision somebody is making, even though that decision that you are making itself is already God at the level of the receptacle of the qabil making that decision, nevertheless, that decision needs to be made, whether to take this turn or that turn. Right?
Yeah.
But when a divination is made in the sense of fortune telling that we see in this whole industry of this, fortune telling industry, in a sense, it is denuding people of that ability to make that decision. And the reason is simple, is that to make a decision that I'm going to take this road rather than that road requires, on a certain level, for someone to be in a existential no man's land, to go on faith. Right? But that is difficult for a lot of people, because everybody wants to know what's going to happen if I take this turn or if I take that turn. Right? We're talking obviously about big life decisions, Whereas what a fortune teller is doing is taking that ability away from people. And then so people, if they believe in the fortune teller, are not going to then make an effort to possibly circumvent whatever it is.
So I was, when I reverted, I was told that very clearly in a dream I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. And I stopped that was years ago. But yeah, I feel like the only thing I can ethically justify is warning people of dangers, because that sort of ties into the spirit that wants to be and preserve. That it's in reverence of that. If I help the person avert, well, destruction, basically.
Yeah.
But everything else, I don't know what I might be averting, like the growth of suffering, the lessons. It's we can't take that approach that we must stop the person from suffering at every turn, because I think that is interfering with, as I said, God's work as such. Like, we can't impose our morality onto it, so we can just give the person, try and polish them up to listen to their own guardian angel,
Yeah,
to preserve themselves.
but let's take another tack on this triplicity that we just looked at. Since this course really came out of the theurgy list, what the wisdom that Ibn Arabi is laying out here in terms of a practitioner in theurgy, someone who's practicing magic. How do we apply what Ibn Arabi is saying here to our own practice? This is the important thing. So you put yourself right in the position of the actor, the theurgist, right? And then there are two other terms. Number one is the actor, the magical practice or the invocation, the amal, right? And then the production, the third entity at the tail end of this. And this is something that every given theurgist needs to now sit down and very carefully work out, because this triplicity that Ibn Arabi is talking about is as much relevant to your practice, your practice working, as to a basic, cosmological scheme about the nature of creation, and God's relation to that. So, because as he's saying, on all of these various levels that we're talking about, the recipient and the actor are all the same, right? So if you are acting from that knowledge that this is the case, then what it behooves you is that in your magical operations is that you operate from this perspective of this triplicity yourself, in order to get those productions of theurgy to actually come into the world. Because let's put it this way: when you desire something, right? Let's say whatever it is, you want a new job, right? And you want to utilize your theurgical abilities to actualize this job. Well, the actualization of the job already exists in your own mind as a reality. So, let's just now look at this, as to what Ibn Arabi is saying. Just as everything, all the intelligibles exists in the mind of God in potential, your own actualization and what you want to happen into the world are existing in your own mind as an intelligible and as a potential. So then now the question is how to bring that intelligible potential into the actualization of your own life through your operation. And this is the path of the theurgist. This is what then makes magic happen, and magic that works. Once you figure that out. But the scheme is very obvious. The theurgist, their theurgy, and the outcome. And on each level, there is a light and a shadow until the final production. You put this formula in practice yourself, and I guarantee you what you seek out in the world, maybe not every time, because there's also a lot of many things that you have to consider, whether it's the timing of the thing, whether it may conflict with something else, all of these things. But if you act from this very basic premise that Ibn Arabi just put in front of us in this chapter of Salih, then you understand how theurgy works.
So it's like you're just choosing from a pool of possibilities that already exist, and you're trying to actualize one of them.
Yeah.
But then there has to be a moral framework. It's very difficult to predict what, that domino that you've done will result in down the track, but then you can't exist without setting off those dominoes anyway.
Sure.
Yeah.
But then again, from another perspective, you're the vehicle for the divine domino, as it were, right? Because, just as we read in the Quran, not a leaf falls in existence without, the will of God.
Mm.
But nevertheless, you're being given a look at, the mirror, you're being given a sneak peek in the practice of magic, in the practice of theurgy, about how the divine creative process actually works. So as above, so below. This is something that a lot of people, and I'm very surprised that a lot of people who come from this Islamic tradition of theurgy forget. Because the creative process that any magician follows is a mirror of the creative process of the creator itself. So if you follow this pattern, then your magic works.
And do you think it's like in Buddhism with karma that the intention is what counts?
Yes, the niyyah is everything. The niyyah, the intention, just like when you pray, when you do the salat, the first thing before you even utter the bismillah is the niyyah.
Thank you.
Khadija.
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
So I'm kind of struggling to position this kind of question, but it's been since the readings and just all this deep conversation. Jazakumullah khairan. Would my understanding be correct that at some level, so I'm very interested in terms of healing and the unfolding of the realities in that sense. And at some level, there is within any individual already that response to that possibility with a yes to take on, let's say, a certain form of sickness. Would my understanding be correct there?
Sure.
And what would be the most positive way from someone who's aware of all these aspects when they're helping and working with people to help them see a different perspective? What kind of input might you give, Bismillah ta'ala?
First of all, you have to assess every situation on its merits. It's not a good idea in these particular situations to reduce everything to a formula. But if you were to follow a formula, what I just said before, I think is kind of the benchmark you should follow, as it were. But also you need to assess each of these particular situations, especially if there's a patient involved, on its actual merits. If we're talking about self-healing, then the mind is an extremely powerful thing, and I've seen this in multiple situations. I even saw it in my own family, where the mind, it can become either the catalyst for the sickness, venturing to death of somebody, or the sickness becoming a wake-up call for them to then heal themselves from it. So in each case, just like in alchemy, we read that the poison is the gift. It really is the fortitude, the inner composition of the person, and how receptive they are to these sorts of ideas to take on board what you're trying to do with them. So if you can create that receptivity for somebody, a patient, to accept and then work with you on that level so that you become their murshida in a sense, it is very easy to heal people. Even with terminal illnesses, I've seen people cure themselves with their heads from things like cancer, like really bad cancer too.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
Because at some level, it must be a deep subconscious and unaware. They're unaware of that aspect within that wants the disease or the illness or the manifestation of it, right?
Yeah. And so then your job becomes, as their guide, to really, slowly and with lots of sensitivity, to break down through these various levels of the darkness and to untangle each of these like a knot. You untangle the knots within their consciousness, and you get to the core issue. And once you get to that core issue and they accept it and they submit to the situation, then you have a very powerful thing to work with to heal them. completely.
SubhanAllah.
Yeah.
Barakallah fi. Thank you.
Look. Anybody else?
I just had I had a couple of thoughts. The way that I was reading the whole free will determinism thing was I wasn't taking al-bada into account. Once you put that in there, it makes a lot more sense. But I'll just share the way that I was thinking about it, because it also leads to a question about the concept of free will. So in the chapter at the bottom of 141 in the one that the translation that we're using, he attributes the becoming of the thing itself at the command of God, and God speaks true, this being understood in the command, just as one who is feared and obeyed commands his servant to stand, the servant stands obediently. And it makes it sound like it's almost like in that statement there's a paradox of it. The servant is the one who's choosing,
Yeah,
but it's also like the servant can't help but choose because God is feared and obeyed. And it almost seems like this coming together of choice and necessity. And then that's, you can apply that.
Do you remember at the very beginning of, sorry, but at the very beginning of the Kitab al-Aql wa Jahl of Khulainis, where we have the hadith of the Aql and the hadith of the higher intelligence and the acosmic ignorance. Once we come to the hadith of the acosmic ignorance, the hadith al-Jahl, right? Conversely to what God commands the intellect, he tells them to come forward. He comes forward and says, step back, it steps back. With the ignorance, God tells it to step forward, it stays still. It tells it to come back, it stays still, just refuses to do anything. And I find this an interesting gloss on this particular thing, that this is the difference between the, let's say, a functional receptacle and a dysfunctional receptacle. A functional receptacle is open to that command and then stands on its own, whereas a dysfunctional one doesn't care and just stays stationary. So in a sense, this is a very interesting, I found this corollary the first time I read this chapter, that this the hadith of the Agbajah that we find in the first book of Khulaini, Usul min al-Kafi, this when you read those, collect those first four hadith together with what Ibn Arabi is saying in this particular paragraph, it starts to make a lot of sense, especially in what he doesn't say in that particular paragraph.
So then perhaps it is possible for a servant not to obey,
Obviously,
in this sense.
of course.
Yeah, and I think we could also talk about the aqal and jahal in metaphysical terms, as I think the jahal would be like, we could divide it into like existence and essence. And
this is
so here
where
we're
I
talking.
think this is where Sheikh Ahmed al-Asai becomes especially apropos, where he says that existence looks to its Lord and essence looks at itself. That's the kind of the metaphorical difference and gloss that he puts between the two, which is a beautiful way of explaining the situation. Yeah.
So essence in Sheikh Ahmed is Ayn here in Ibn Arabi?
Ain Mahia, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, also just the concept of choice. I think in Usul al-Kafi, the term that's used, I think it might be in that same hadith about the matter between the two matters. I think it's ikhtiyar.
Yes.
And I'm in the history of philosophy, there's this whole question about when because the concept of free will didn't always exist in Western philosophy. It came into being through through Christian thought.
Yeah.
And I wonder in relation to Islamic thought if there even is such a thing as free will. I mean, I guess we're saying that there is, but they're like the more ancient conceptions are like you have choice, but not necessarily choice between alternatives. It's a kind of compatibilist point of view, but we don't want to attribute that kind of thing here to Ibn Arabi. I'm wondering, like,
well, we can, so long as we understand which level at which we are talking about it, where the voluntarism is actually occurring. Obviously, it doesn't occur at the level of the universal will, because at the at the level of the phase al-Aqdas, these are all just discharges of complete potentiality with all of their trajectories and all of the contradictions and paradox all existing simultaneously. But that voluntarism, once we come down the scale and into the spatial temporal world of multiplicity, then the suggestion is, especially from someone like Haydar al-Muli, that anything can take any turn at any time. And what he's saying, which I find very profound, is that these possibilities are already existing in that Ein Thabita. So it's not as if it's a free will where it is being a particular will in the matter or effect is being generated sui generis. These possibilities are simultaneously existing in that immutable archetypal essence, such that, in a sense, we can say that all possibilities, for whatever, have already been created by the Godhead within everything. This suggestion I find a lot more salutary as an explanation in the way that Ibn Arabi himself puts the matter, whether in the Fusus or the Futuhat al-Makkiyah. I think this is where I think the Shiite commentators of Ibn Arabi are a little bit more attuned to some of these issues that you're asking about. So then that segues perfectly with what the hadith of the Amr bin Amrayn actually means.
Yeah. So choice is a matter of revelation, right? It's a matter of what we choose to reveal from what exists. Okay.
With the leaven, the khamir of this whole situation being your awareness of things. So the more aware you are, the less you are a victim to the fates, as it were.
Okay. And I just had one other observation towards the end, the very last paragraph, where it releases himself from dependence on others and knows that good and evil come to him only from himself. Excuses all creatures regarding what they manifest, even though they themselves make no excuse. Knowing as he does that all he undergoes is from himself. Here, so I've always understood Ibn Arabi's position as saying that even everything comes from us, including natural evils. But here it sounds like he's saying even goods and evils from other beings with volition come from us. I don't know if I'm understanding that correctly, but
no. Well, yes and no. Just like with everything with Ibn Arabi, the perception of what is relative evil is always dependent on who is looking, from what standpoint they are, because from the standpoint of the other side, what they're doing is not evil, right? So yes, from that perspective, one can say that even the perception of the other side as being complete evil in one's side, from one's eyes, is one's own perception of the matter. But by the same token, the other side themselves are subject to the same laws. So what they're projecting of the other side as being evil is their own perception. It's from themselves that they're perceiving these things in such ways.
Okay. Because the concern there was that I think in a previous chapter he talks about the interdependence of things in the cosmos, So that way of understanding it would preserve the interdependence. We're still acted upon by other, but our perception is not acted upon. That's something that we have.
Well, even our
Control.
perceptions are always acted upon, but yet the perceiver is still themselves. Okay? This also is kind of the same issue, is that, for example, the more aware of you are, the more aware you become of something, the less subject you are to these interdependencies that may be coloring your perception of a situation. You have your own independent point of view, rather than, taking on someone's point of view. Let's take it, like, for example, in the concept of a war, right? Every war in history has to build consensus to go to war. Okay? Two kings or two presidents or two leaders don't go to war with each other personally. They create a consensus within a society. They have armies, etc. They meet on the battlefield. Without that consensus building, no conflict in history can occur. Period. So if you are more aware, the more aware that you become, and let us say you come to the point of being, you become so aware of a situation, you become a conscientious objector, right? Even though your own side is going to war with another side, yet you are then not subject to that consensus of war making that the rest of your peers may be. You are not acted upon by that consensus in that interdependency. You see the interdependency, but yet you're not acted upon it. That consensus does not affect you because you understand where it's coming from.
But so in that case, it's an interdependency that it's beneficial for us to escape from. But there would be other interdependencies that we might desire.
Yes, like the interdependencies that exist on the higher planes from us. To be more conscious of these other subtle unseen realms in front of us that we don't sensibly see all the time, and maybe interact with them rather than other humans.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Can I just say a quick word about Schrodinger's cat?
Mm-hmm.
Just for Vanessa, I don't know if this is common knowledge here, so I just want to say, like, it's a thought experiment in a completely in the mind of a physicist, you know what I mean, a cosmologist. They're imagining a cat inside of a sealed box, and you cannot see inside of the box without opening the lid. And you have no way of knowing the state of the cat until you open the lid and look inside. And the question is, there's two possible states. The cat's either dead or it's alive. And so the idea is that until an observer unseals the box and peeks under the lid and makes the observation is what collapses the waveform and determines the outcome. So the cat's going to be either one or the other, dead or alive, depending on the observation. And if there is no observation, the idea is that the cat is neither dead nor alive. It's in some sort of suspended animation in a kind of in-between state, and it doesn't have any existence without the observation. So I just wanted to make that clear that I don't like the theory. Like, I personally, I love the idea. Like, Schrodinger's cat is a famous thought experiment in the West, but a lot of people, like, I think, misunderstand, because for me, it's silly. I mean, because down here at this level of reality in space and time, where you have a physical box in front of you and a human being trying to decide, is the cat dead or alive inside that box? For me, the cat is either dead or alive before you look. But that's my opinion anyway. I think it's a far stretch of the imagination to assume that your observation is what collapses the reality of the cat. Personally, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's so theoretical. It's like it implies that
Yeah.
there is nothing happening without our observation. At
Yeah.
the same time, there are, so it's not a good example, I think, because I think there are other experiments that show the effect of observation on particles and particles behaving differently when they're observed versus not observed, which would be, yeah, better examples of the effect of witnessing or something on the way things behave. But yeah, Schrodinger's cat's kind of like, well, doesn't matter what you think, buddy. You know, the cat's
Yeah.
doing what it's going to do, whether you look at it or not. Yeah. But I don't know,
Exactly.
I could barely do justice to the actual events of it, let alone the concept. So maybe there's more to it. Yeah. Or it could
They're
just fall into that silly hypothetical realm of vacuum.
Yeah, I think it's silly hypothetical, but there probably is more to it. But for me, yeah, I think we always have to be on guard against our own vanity and to assume that we are the thing that makes reality what it is. I mean, on a level, like, not to contradict what Ibn Arabi is saying, because there's the paradox. We are responsible, and yet we're not responsible. I mean, because we are God and we're not God. So
One thing,
yeah, anyway.
just don't forget here, sorry to interject, that what drives what Ibn Arabi is saying here in the last part of this chapter, I think that Mr. Abrahamov missed, is that the concept of iftikhar, right? Dependency is the paramount concept running through what Ibn Arabi is saying, that at every level that the servant is dependent to the level above himself. So the shadow is dependent on the light at all times. So yes, on the one hand, we can say that the observer affects, the observed. But the question then becomes in this situation, who is the observer? Who is the observer?
Exactly. That's a great question. That is the question. Who is the observer? Is it me? Is it you? Is it all of us together? So that's what's wrong with that thought experiment. Is it's too simplistic?
Or even beyond that, the real observer here being God.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit like a tree falls in the forest kind of thing. It's like,
yeah. But it's a fun thought experiment.
Yeah, I mean, there are the maybe more the point is that once something's happened, once something's crystallized, it's kind of like you're on that particular timeline. Whereas in the state of potential, and I not to hark back to doing psychic readings all the time, but you do see that where there are things that are kind of, they sort of approach from a kind of void of possibilities, but they haven't necessarily happened yet when it comes to like precognition, So there are some things that you see that they do happen, and other things are more like they come close to happening. So there's something there in the way things manifest from that place. And I like to think that quantum physics might be able to explain it, but I think it's just incredibly emergent at this point.
Yeah. And do you mind if I just ask a quick question directly to Vanessa? Vanessa, could you explain the concept of shifting timelines? I've been seeing that a lot lately. What exactly does it mean when someone says you've shifted timelines? I think I know, but I'd like to hear you say something.
In my own experience, I might see something ahead, and then if I don't act so my mistake used to be that if I saw something ahead in the future, like I had a vision of this particular thing, then it was going to happen. And that was like a fatalism in me, that I thought it was just preordained and I didn't have to do anything. And then I discovered over the years that if I didn't act, if I didn't make certain choices to help make that thing actualize, it just passed. And then it wouldn't happen. And then there would be a new kind of path that eventuated from me not choosing that thing. And so I had to really abandon my ideas of predestiny, even though strangely I feel like I have actually lived my life backwards in terms of watching everything kind of eventuate that I saw years ahead, which is bizarre. But yeah, so people use it like in the new age way. It can be used a bit well, it's more, they talk about more a collective example of that. There's sort of micro and macro levels, but my understanding now is that certain timelines are just courses of events, you know, and the way things end up eventuating, like, you know, the cat being alive or dead, and then you just really got to make do with whatever you're then in, like whatever timeline as such, meaning trajectory of cause and effect you're now inhabiting. You need to do your best from that point, instead of either regretting the timeline that you didn't enact, you know, or yeah, so you still got to use that. That was what took me a long time to learn, is that I still have to be active, you know, in whatever state whatever I've chosen. And yeah, you're in a partnership with those events. So they won't just, some things will have a high level of probability where they'll kind of eventuate whether you do anything or not. I've noticed, like, some things have a lot of push behind them, and other things are very subtle. So all you can do is really listen to the clues, and that's where your own intuition comes in. If someone else can't tell you really how to act on that, they can only empower you to not just, it's one thing to get the message from your intuition, it's another thing to listen to it. And the thing that stops you from listening to it is, you'll usually find, is all your own trauma and conditioning that paralyzes you from thinking that
and fears and anxieties. That's a great answer. Thank you. So basically, it's your choice. You make a choice and you open up a whole new chain of causality, and that's the timeline. Yeah. Okay.
That's basically the Akbarian Shiite concept of al-Bada, of the alteration of the will.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Khadija, you had a question.
Bismillah. Yes. Just in that, just what Vanessa just said, and my question would be kind of like, isn't the irada, the ability to act itself, our ability to act itself, coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Yes.
You may have the intent, like even simple as fasting, and when the event comes to unfold, that doesn't happen. It can't happen. So that the qudra and the willpower, and the power itself for it to manifest really belongs to Allah.
Yes.
Unless I'm astaghfirullah.
Yeah, of course it does. On the level of the universal will. I mean, that will has instantiated you, right? However, on these lower levels, dense levels of spatio-temporality in the world of multiplicity, it is possible for one to be veiled from that will. And that
Could you expand?
This is why you know, the suluk and raising the awareness of every given person on this path is such a pivotal thing, because the more aware you become, the more the veils that you remove from your own consciousness, the more you are aware of that divine will. Whereas, you know, even though, as we read in the last chapter, everything is on the straight path, nevertheless, that straight path, the difference between awareness and unawareness is the difference between being those who have had the bounty of God bestowed upon them and those who are misled, even though they're both on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. So this would be an Akbarian reading of that final verse of the Surah Al-Fatiha. So the Zaleen are also on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, but they're just not aware of what the divine will is. Whereas those who have had the bounties, alidhina and antum alayhim, those are the ones that understand what the will of God is at any given particular time, and so can consciously act based on the divine will to them.
SubhanAllah. Because for
If
me,
I
this
may-
goes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Vanessa. It's going to add that I believe it does go hand in hand with trust when you're in that moment of its unfolding.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vanessa. Sorry.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the thing in Islam, and what some people reject religion because they don't like discipline. They say they're anti-religion, but they don't like discipline. And
yeah, but this argument goes out of the window if if it means that they don't wake up on Mondays to go to work, and so there's no money in their bank account at the end of the week. That argument goes out the window. Then they have all the discipline in the world.
Yes, and that's why I just admiring that about Islam is that it develops your will, so your discipline so much, your self-control so much, that ironically, it's this concept of surrender and submission, but you're actually in a very highly developed state if you're doing it right of will, of cause cause and effect with your own choices.
I had this exact same conversation about 15 years ago with a very seasoned Thelemite, who really believed that they invented the concept of will in all metaphysics. And at the end of this conversation, when I just presented to him this very thing that you just said, this guy had to go back to the drawing board. Because that is the case. And the thing is that the will orders things, not in the way that we understand the concept of order, but when a given soul is aligned with the divine will by it whether by osmosis or whatever, it naturally orders everything around itself. And so in the example that you gave, Muslims follow a discipline, that is centered around the prayer. So it's centered around Allah, right? And so the centeredness of that subject, of this Muslim subject around God, centers everything else around themselves. Right? I mean, this is the optimum condition. Unfortunately, in other areas, Muslims fall short. Like, for example, having real unity amongst each other. But in the individual life, yes, this is a centering cause. It is centering you, and that centering has a will that orders things.
I think when it becomes black is where it's that sort of do as you will should be the whole of the law. There's
that's how this is. I mean, this is what Crowley's little aphorism doesn't make any sense. But he then admits later on, he makes a very Ibn Arabian kind of admission that potentially if you do whatever you want, your will may collide with the will of somebody else who wants to do whatever they want. So you need to temper this at some point. But
do you think the remedy for that is to focus back on the spirit and will of other things to be, or what do you think is, or
well, first of all, anyone who is truly in attune with themselves, right, will not do whatever they want to do for a very simple reason, is because when you are authentically in attune with your own soul, you understand the limits of things in the outer world.
Yeah, it's not even possible to just rewrite all the laws of physics and do what you want.
So that perspective that believes that it can do whatever it wants is coming from the perspective of the nafs al-amara. It's coming from the perspective of the soul commanding to evil and wants to dominate. That's not the will. That's a very animalistic kind of impulse of wanting to dominate, being dominator. Very different from what the will is. And this is why I don't think Thelemites get what the concept of the will really is.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the concept of evil. Definition of evil is dominance without love. Like, we have to learn the lesson that we can't just dominate on this earth, even though everything else is
not
geared
a will.
towards dominance.
I mean, maybe they understand this concept, and maybe the English language lends itself to that particular kind of understanding. But from a higher metaphysical point of view, that's not a will. Because then, I put this to these people many times, your will is constrained by an impulse. Whereas the will, by its nature, is a universal reality. It's divine. It transcends particularized impulses.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to justify antisocial behaviors in an individualism paradigm of the West, I guess. Because doing what thou will, and it harm none. If you go to theirs was a lot better, right?
Yeah.
Because it's about antisocial versus pro-social, which religion has to govern.
Sure.
Or things just.
The way Ibn Arabi
there's no
himself
mercy.
puts it, the way Ibn Arabi on a practical level, let's make this the last one because we're starting to go over an hour and 30 minutes. But the way that Ibn Arabi puts it is that, and he puts it in several different poems, it's a refrain that occurs in a lot of his poetry in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, is putting things in their proper place. So this has been my gauge, in understanding what the nature of the will is on a practical level. When you, as opposed to what, the Thelemic formula says, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Ibn Arabi says, a God-man, a true insan al-Kamil, knows to put things in their proper place. And that can be anything. And it can manifest as anything, but it doesn't mean do whatever you want.
Yeah, you have to consider the interrelationship with all the other things that want to be.
Exactly. Precisely. Yeah. Anywho, we're starting to go beyond the 1 hour 30-minute mark. I will stop it right here. And so let us begin now the chapter of Shu'aib, and the dhikr for the chapter of Shu'aib is Ya Muqallabu, transformer, which is based on the attribute of this chapter of Shu'aib, which is qalb, which is heart. So we'll leave this session 16 here and then come back next week on session 17 with the chapter of Shu'aib. Everybody have a good week until we meet again this time next week. Ya Fatih.